My name is Alina Brooks. I'm 34 years old and I work as a pediatric respiratory therapist at Willamette Children's Hospital in Portland, Oregon. On a Tuesday evening in March, I stood in the hallway outside apartment 4C at the Somerset Arms, holding my 6-year-old son Mateo's nebulizer bag in one hand and a phone recording in the other, while my landlord, a man named Gary Halloran, told me with a small, tired laugh that I was the only tenant in this building who makes a federal case out of a little bit of paint peeling. I wasn't talking about paint. I was talking about the black, spreading bloom of mold behind my son's bedroom wall, the one Gary had been promising to look into for 11 months, the one that had sent Mateo to the emergency room twice that winter with breathing so labored the on-call doctor used the word concerning 3 separate times in front of me. A word I, of all people, understood the full weight of, having heard other parents receive it from the other side of a hospital bed more times than I could count over the course of my career. I remember exactly how the hallway smelled that evening: old carpet, faint mildew, the particular staleness of a building whose ventilation had never quite kept pace with its age. And I remember the specific, deliberate calm I made myself hold in my voice. The same calm I use at work when a parent needs to hear something difficult without being further destabilized by my own reaction to it. I didn't raise my voice in that hallway. I said, "Noted," the same word I'd used with him 4 times before, and went back inside to finish packing Mateo's nebulizer for the night. What Gary Halloran didn't know was that I had spent the last 7 months quietly building a file, the kind of file a hospital professional learns to build almost by instinct, time-stamped, cross-referenced, unshakable. And that in exactly 19 days, a city inspector was going to walk through the Somerset Arms with a clipboard and a moisture meter, and Gary Halloran's entire building was going to come to a stop. If you've ever been the tenant labeled difficult simply for asking someone to do the job they were already being paid to do, welcome back, this one's for you. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from tonight and hit subscribe, because this story has a turn in it I think you're going to want to see all the way through. Let me take you back to where this actually started, because a moment like that hallway conversation doesn't happen out of nowhere. It comes from almost a year of small, deniable dismissals, and you can't understand how I finally caught it without understanding how carefully and how casually it was allowed to build. I moved into the Somerset Arms in June of 2021, a 24-unit brick building on the edge of Portland's Buckman neighborhood, built in 1962 and showing every one of those 60 years in its plumbing and its window seals. I was 32, recently divorced, with a 4-year-old son and a nursing degree that had got me a stable, meaningful job, but not in Portland's rental market, an easy one. Rent at the Somerset Arms was $1,100 a month for a 2-bedroom, roughly $300 below comparable units in the neighborhood, and I told myself moving in that the lower rent explained the building's rough edges, the temperamental radiator, the water stains in the stairwell ceiling, the slightly musty smell in the basement laundry room. I told myself, the way I imagine a lot of tenants in older buildings tell themselves, that a little wear was simply the price of an affordable roof over my son's head in a city that had become steadily less affordable every year I'd lived in it. I want to say a little more about the specific circumstances that made the Somerset Arms feel, at the time, like exactly the right choice, because I think it matters to understanding why I was so reluctant later to jeopardize it. My divorce had finalized that spring, an amicable enough process on paper but a financially destabilizing one in practice, splitting a single household income into 2 considerably tighter budgets. My ex-husband, Marcus, had relocated to Seattle for work 8 months after we separated, which meant I was, functionally, a single parent managing childcare, a full-time hospital schedule, and a housing search simultaneously, on a single respiratory therapist's salary in a city where 2-bedroom apartments routinely listed for $1,400 or more. The Somerset Arms, with its below-market rent and a landlord who seemed, in that first walkthrough, genuinely warm toward Mateo, felt less like a compromise and more like a stroke of real luck. Gary Halloran owned and personally managed the Somerset Arms, along with 2 other small apartment buildings across the city, a business he'd inherited from his father in 2009 and run, by his own description in our very first conversation, the old-fashioned way: "I know all my tenants, I fix what needs fixing, no corporate nonsense." I remember believing that description genuinely for the first 8 or 9 months I lived there. Gary was 58, gruff but often good-humored, the kind of landlord who'd stop and chat in the parking lot about the Trail Blazers or ask after Mateo by name. It would take me the better part of a year to understand that being personally known by your landlord and being genuinely cared for by him were 2 very different things, and that Gary had built an entire management style around blurring the line between them. I want to say a little more about Gary's father, Desmond Halloran, because I think it matters to understand where Gary's particular management philosophy actually came from, even if it doesn't excuse it. Mrs. Acaffer, who'd known both men across 3 decades of tenancy, told me once that Desmond had run the Somerset Arms through the 1990s and early 2000s on razor-thin margins, personally doing much of the maintenance work himself well into his 60s, genuinely present in a way that had apparently earned real tenant loyalty over the years. Gary, according to Mrs. Acaffer, had inherited the building along with a specific story about what kind of landlord his father had been and had spent years, in her words, playing his father's greatest hits without ever learning to actually do the work behind them. He'd kept the low rents. The personal phone calls, the parking lot chats about basketball, all the visible signals of an attentive, old-fashioned landlord, while quietly cutting the actual maintenance spending that had made those signals meaningful under his father's ownership. I didn't fully understand the weight of that distinction until much later, but it explained something that had puzzled me for months. How a man who seemed, in almost every individual interaction, genuinely warm and reasonable, could preside over a pattern of neglect so consistent and so costly to the people who trusted him. I remember one of my first real interactions with him as a landlord rather than a friendly neighbor in September of 2021, 3 months after moving in, when I reported a slow leak under my kitchen sink. Gary came by himself 2 days later, tightened a fitting, and told me cheerfully, "See, this is why I don't hire some big management company. They'd have had you filling out forms for 2 weeks. I take care of my people." I thanked him sincerely at the time. I didn't yet understand that taking care of my people would, over the following 2 years, come to mean the fastest, cheapest fix available, applied just often enough to keep tenants from formally escalating anything, and never once involving an actual licensed contractor for anything beyond the most visible surface-level problems. I remember, too, a conversation with my next-door neighbor, an 81-year-old widow named Adiz Acaffer, who'd lived in the Somerset Arms since 1994, longer than any other tenant in the building. Mrs. Acaffer told me over tea in her apartment that same fall, "Gary's not a bad man, sweetheart, but he's a cheap one, and cheap men find creative ways to convince themselves those are different things." I laughed at the time. I would think about that sentence many, many times over the following 2 years. That was the shape of things from the very beginning, quiet and easy to miss if you weren't specifically looking for it. Problems got acknowledged. Problems got minimized. And for a long time I told myself the gap between acknowledgement and actual repair was simply how older buildings worked, that I should be grateful for affordable rent and a landlord who at least returned my calls, and that anything more than that was perhaps an unreasonable expectation for the price I was paying. That belief cost my son's health more than I will ever be able to fully calculate. The mold itself first appeared, as far as I can date it precisely, in early April of 2023, nearly 2 years into my tenancy. A small dark patch roughly the size of a dinner plate low on the wall behind Mateo's bed, near an exterior corner of the building where I'd later learn a persistent roof flashing failure had been letting water seep slowly into the wall cavity for months before it ever became visible on the interior surface. I reported it to Gary on April 9th by text message with a photo attached, and he responded the same day, "Probably just condensation from the cold snap, keep an eye on it and let me know if it spreads." I want to be honest that I accepted this explanation at the time. Not because I was naive about mold exactly, but because I genuinely didn't yet have any reason to distrust him, and because "keep an eye on it" felt, in the moment, like a reasonable, measured response rather than a dismissal. I want to describe that first week a little more fully, because it's a useful window into how completely ordinary the beginning of all this felt. I remember standing in Mateo's doorway that Sunday morning, coffee in hand, looking at a mark on the wall no bigger than a saucer, thinking almost nothing of it beyond a vague mental note to keep the room better ventilated. Mateo, 4 years old at the time, no, 6 by April of 2023, I should say clearly, since he'd had his 6th birthday that January, asked me what the gray spot was, and I told him it was probably just water from the rain, nothing to worry about. I believed that completely. I had no reason that particular Sunday to believe otherwise, and I think it's important to say that clearly, because so much of what came later depended on exactly how reasonable each individual step of dismissal felt in isolation. There's a second piece of that first month worth including. because it connects to something I'd noticed even before Mateo's wall ever developed a visible problem, though I hadn't yet understood the connection. The Somerset Arms basement laundry room had carried a faint, musty smell for as long as I'd lived there, something I'd always attributed without much thought to the building's age and the damp Portland climate generally. In April of 2023, the same month the patch first appeared in Mateo's room, I remember standing in that laundry room waiting for a dryer cycle and noticing, for the first time, that the smell seemed slightly stronger than usual near the far wall, closer to the water heater closet Inspector Ferreira would eventually flag as a serious violation nearly a year later. I mentioned it to Gary in passing during our text exchange about Mateo's wall, almost as an afterthought. Also, the laundry room's been smelling more musty than usual lately, might be worth a look too. He responded briefly, probably just needs a dehumidifier. I'll grab one. A dehumidifier did appear in the laundry room within the week, a genuinely reasonable-looking response that, I'd later learn, treated a symptom of the same building-wide moisture problem without ever addressing its source, exactly the same pattern that would play out in Mateo's room for the following 11 months. By early May, the patch had roughly doubled in size, and I texted Gary again on May 6th with updated photos. This time he came by in person 2 days later, looked at it for perhaps 90 seconds and said, "Yeah, that's mold all right, I'll get someone out here to bleach it and reseal that corner." I asked whether the underlying moisture source had been identified, since I'd read enough working in a hospital to know that surface bleaching without addressing a moisture source simply delays the problem rather than solving it. Gary said, "It's an old building, Alina. There's always some moisture somewhere, we just have to manage it as it comes up. That's honestly just part of the city living in a place this age." I told myself he probably knew more about the building's specific quirks than I did, that he'd owned it for 14 years by then, and that trusting his experience was the reasonable thing to do. That was the first rationalization I built and leaned on for months. He knows this building better than I do, and pushing harder might just make me the difficult tenant nobody wants to deal with quickly. I want to include one more detail from that May visit, because it's a small example of the specific rhetorical move Gary used in some form over and over across the following year. Standing in Mateo's room that afternoon, he added almost as an aside, "You know, I could just as easily raise everyone's rent to cover a bigger maintenance budget, but I try to keep things affordable for families like yours instead." There's a trade-off there, and I think most tenants appreciate that, even if it means things move a little slower sometimes. I remember nodding along, genuinely persuaded in the moment that I was benefiting from a fair trade-off rather than absorbing the cost of deferred maintenance directly in my son's lungs without ever having agreed to that particular exchange. There's a second piece of that May worth including, because it's the first time the situation at home began quietly affecting my work, something I hadn't anticipated and wasn't especially proud of at the time. On May 19th, during a shift at Willamette Children's, I found myself, for the first time in my career, distracted enough during a routine equipment check that a colleague had to point out I'd missed initialing a form. A small error quickly corrected, but unusual enough for me that my charge nurse, a woman named Denise Kowalczyk who'd supervised me for 4 years, asked afterward whether everything was all right. I told her honestly but incompletely that I was dealing with some stuff at home, and she didn't push further, though she did say, "You know where my door is if that changes." I didn't take her up on that offer until many months later, closer to the end of the whole ordeal, but I remember her saying it, and I remember filing it away the same way I'd started filing away everything else that spring, carefully, quietly, without yet knowing which pieces I'd eventually need. The someone Gary sent turned out to be his brother-in-law, a man named Pete who did general handyman work around all 3 of Gary's properties, and who spent, by my own timed observation, 11 minutes in Mateo's room on June 3rd, wiping the patch down with a bleach solution and applying a coat of mold-resistant paint directly over it, without opening the wall to check for water intrusion behind the drywall at all. The patch was invisible again within a day, and I remember feeling genuinely a small wave of relief, telling myself the problem had been handled. I didn't yet understand that painting over an active moisture source is one of the most common and most dangerous shortcuts in property management, because it doesn't just fail to solve the underlying problem. It actively hides the visual warning sign that would otherwise prompt someone to look closer before the damage became serious. I remember specifically texting a photo of the freshly painted wall to my sister in Denver that same evening, with a caption that read simply, "Finally handled." I still have that text thread saved, and I look at it now knowing what I know with a strange kind of tenderness for the version of myself who genuinely believed at the end of June 2023 that an 11-minute bleach and paint job represented the end of the problem rather than its beginning. I want to pause here because I don't want this to sound like nothing good existed at the Somerset Arms during this period, because that wouldn't be honest. Mrs. Okafor that same June noticed I'd been looking tired and started without ever being asked, leaving small containers of jollof rice outside my door on evenings after long hospital shifts, along with little notes in careful handwriting that said things like, "Eat something warm, sweetheart, you're no good to that boy running on empty." I still have a handful of those notes. She became, over that year, one of the steadiest sources of comfort I had in a situation that was slowly, quietly becoming less and less comfortable. I want to describe one particular evening with Mrs. Okafor more fully, because it captures something about her that the summary doesn't quite convey. In late June, after an especially long shift, I found her sitting on the small bench outside our shared stairwell waiting, she told me, for absolutely no reason at all, though I understood even then that she'd likely been listening for my car and timed her sitting accordingly. She patted the bench beside me and asked, without any preamble, how Mateo's cough was doing, a detail I hadn't specifically mentioned to her but that she'd apparently noticed through the thin apartment walls we shared. When I told her the doctor thought it was probably allergies, she made a small, skeptical sound and said, "Could be. Could also be that wall Pete painted over without ever really looking at what was behind it." I watched him do it. 11 minutes if that. I remember being faintly startled that she'd clocked the same detail I had independently and filed it away the same way I had quietly without yet knowing what to do with it. By mid-July, Mateo began coughing more persistently at night, a dry, tight cough I initially attributed to seasonal allergies, common enough in Portland summers. I mentioned it to his pediatrician at a routine visit on July 19th, who noted it in his chart as likely allergic monitor, a note that would become significant later, once we understood what had actually been developing behind that repainted wall the entire time. I didn't yet connect the cough to the mold, because the mold, as far as I could see, was gone. I want to include a small detail from that same July that, in hindsight, was an early warning sign I simply didn't have the context to read correctly yet. Mateo's daycare teacher mentioned, at pickup one afternoon, that he'd seemed more tired than usual that week, napping longer than his classmates and needing more encouragement than usual to join outdoor play. I attributed it at the time to a growth spurt or a mild summer cold working its way through his system, the kind of explanation that felt entirely reasonable in isolation and only became legible as part of a larger pattern months later, once I sat down and built the full timeline. In August, the patch reappeared, larger than before, roughly the size of a dinner tray now, and this time accompanied by a faint but unmistakable musty smell in Mateo's room that hadn't been there previously. I texted Gary on August 14th more directly this time, "The mold is back and it's bigger than before. I don't think painting over it worked. Can we get someone to actually open the wall and check for water damage?" Gary called me that evening rather than texting and said in a tone that was, for the first time, faintly exasperated, "Alina, I hear you, but opening up a wall is a whole different level of expense and disruption. Let's try treating it more aggressively first before we go tearing into drywall, okay? I've got 24 units to manage. I can't gut a wall every time there's a spot of mildew." I told myself again that his perspective made a certain kind of practical sense, that landlords genuinely did have to weigh cost against severity, and that I should give the more aggressive treatment a chance before pushing for something as disruptive as opening a wall. I want to include a specific memory from that same call, because it's the first time Gary explicitly invoked the language of fairness to other tenants as a reason not to act on my specific concern, a rhetorical move he returned more than once over the following months. He said near the end of that conversation, "I've got to be consistent across the building, Alina. I can't just get a wall for you and not do the same for everyone else who's got a little spot somewhere. That wouldn't be fair to the other 23 units." I remember finding that argument genuinely persuasive at the time, a kind of appeal to equal treatment that sounded, on its surface, almost admirable. It would take me months to recognize that treating everyone equally and addressing no one's actual problem were in Gary's hands functionally the same policy, applied selectively enough that it always seemed to justify an action specifically in my case. Pete came back on September 2nd, this time using a stronger commercial mold treatment and, at my insistence, actually cutting a small 12-inch inspection hole in the drywall near the base of the affected area. What he found, according to what he told me directly that day, standing in Mateo's room with a flashlight, was some dampness back there. Might be worth having someone look at the roof flashing on that corner. I asked whether he was going to report that to Gary formally in writing, and he said, "I'll mention it, yeah." I have no record that he ever did, and Gary when I followed up myself 3 days later. Said only, Pete didn't flag anything urgent, we'll keep monitoring. This is the point at which I started quietly taking my own photographs with timestamps, a habit I'd later be deeply grateful for, though at the time it felt almost paranoid, almost like I was building a case against a man who I still mostly believed simply had too many buildings and too little help. I want to describe Pete a little more directly here, because he ends up mattering more to this story than his relatively small role in the timeline might suggest. Pete Ostrander was Gary's brother-in-law, married to Gary's younger sister, and had done handyman work across all 3 of Gary's properties for roughly 6 years by that point, without, as far as I could ever determine, any formal licensing beyond general handyman work that didn't legally require it. He wasn't unkind, and in our various interactions across that inspection whole visit and the ones that followed, he seemed, if anything, quietly uncomfortable with how thin his own interventions were, more than once suggesting, gently, that a real contractor would probably do more than he could. I've thought about Pete often since everything resolved, because he occupied an uncomfortable middle position in this entire story, not a villain exactly, but someone whose quiet discomfort never once translated into the kind of documented formal flag that might have changed anything, a pattern I understand better now than I did at the time, having spent nearly a year in a similar position myself before I finally changed course. There's a second incident from that same September I want to include, because it's the first time Gary's usual reasonable tone briefly slipped into something closer to a veiled threat, though phrased, characteristically, in the gentlest possible terms. My lease was up for renewal that month, and during the renewal conversation held in his office rather than by text, Gary mentioned, almost as an aside while reviewing the paperwork, "You know, market rate for a unit like yours right now is closer to $1,400. I've kept you at 11 for 3 years running because you've always been easy to work with. I'd hate for a maintenance disagreement to change how I think about renewals going forward." I remember sitting across from him in that small office, the inspection hole in Mateo's wall still open and undocumented, understanding even then. On some level, I wasn't ready to fully name that I'd just been told politely that my continued affordable rent was contingent on my continued patience regarding a problem that was, at that very moment, actively worsening behind a wall 6 feet from my sleeping child. I signed the renewal. I told myself the comment had been an innocent aside about market rates, not a warning. I understand now that it was almost certainly both at once, and that the ambiguity itself was the point deniable enough to walk back if I'd pushed on it, clear enough to do its intended work regardless. Mateo's cough by October had become a regular nighttime feature, bad enough that I started sleeping with my bedroom door open specifically to hear him if it worsened. On October 11th, he woke at 2 in the morning struggling to breathe in a way that was unmistakably different from ordinary coughing. A tight, high-pitched wheeze I recognized immediately from work as respiratory distress requiring real attention. I took him to Willamette Children's myself, using my own hospital badge to move us through triage faster than the general public line, a small professional privilege I remember feeling grateful for and guilty about in equal measure. He was diagnosed that night with acute bronchospasm and, for the first time in his life, prescribed a rescue inhaler. I want to describe that night in more detail than I have so far, because I think the specifics matter more than the summary. I remember carrying Mateo down the stairwell of the Somerset Arms at 2 in the morning, past the same water-stained ceiling I'd walked under hundreds of times without much thought, feeling for the first time a genuine physical fear that had nothing to do with hypothetical future risk, and everything to do with the actual sound my son was making trying to get air into his lungs. I remember the specific, practiced calm I had to summon as a professional, the part of my brain that could name what was happening clinically, running alongside the much less composed part of me that was simply a mother watching her child struggle to breathe in the middle of the night. I remember, too, the particular quiet of the emergency room waiting area at that hour, and how strange it felt to be on the other side of triage, waiting instead of directing for the first time in years. The attending physician asked me directly whether there was any mold or significant dust exposure at home. I told her about the wall. She said plainly, that would be consistent with what I'm seeing. I'd get that fully remediated, not just treated, as soon as possible. I texted Gary a photo of Mateo's hospital discharge paperwork the next morning. He responded 4 hours later, "So sorry to hear that, hope he feels better soon. I'll have Pete take another look this week." I remember reading that response standing in my kitchen, exhausted, having gotten perhaps 90 minutes of sleep, and feeling something shift slightly in how I understood the situation, not yet anger. Not yet the full clarity that would come later, but a small, cold recognition that Pete taking another look had never once, across 6 months by then, actually solved anything, and that a hospitalization apparently wasn't enough on its own to change that pattern. Pete did not come that week or the following week. When I followed up on November 6th, nearly a month after the ER visit, Gary said, "Been swamped with a burst pipe at the building on Ankeny. I promise Mateo's room is next on the list." I want to be honest about something here. By November, I had begun quietly researching tenant rights in Oregon, reading through the state's habitability statutes on my phone during hospital breaks. Though I still hadn't told anyone at work or in my own family how serious the situation had actually become, partly out of a reluctance to sound alarmist, and partly, I think now, out of a lingering hope that Gary would simply, eventually, do the right thing without my having to escalate anything formally. I want to include one more detail from that November, because it's the first time a coworker at the hospital, entirely by accident, brushed up against what was happening at home. A respiratory colleague named Sandra Kwan noticed me reviewing pediatric asthma trigger literature on a break room tablet that wasn't related to any of our current patients, and asked, gently, whether everything was okay at home. I gave her a partial, minimized version of the situation, still not fully ready to say the whole thing out loud even to someone I trusted professionally. She said only, "If it's what I think it might be, don't wait as long as people usually do before they act on it. I've seen too many families wait." I nodded and changed the subject, not yet ready to hear how directly that advice applied to my own household. If any of this is starting to sound familiar, the reasonable-sounding delays, the promises that keep sliding to next week, the quiet, mounting worry you've been carrying mostly alone, go ahead and comment the word "documented" below, because that's exactly where I was standing by the end of that November. And if you haven't yet, hit subscribe, because the next part of this story is where the delays finally stop being deniable. In December, with the inspection hole in the wall still uncovered, cold Portland winter rain drove moisture directly into the cavity for weeks at a stretch. And by December 20th, when I finally, formally in writing, demanded Gary send a licensed contractor rather than Pete, the mold had spread visibly beyond the original patch, climbing nearly to the ceiling along one full stud bay, with a smell now noticeable from the hallway outside Mateo's closed bedroom door. Gary's response, sent the same day, read, "I hear you're frustrated, I really do, but the holidays are a hard time to get contractors out here. Everyone's booked. I promise we'll sort this in January." I moved Mateo's mattress into my own room that same week, a decision that felt at the time like a temporary accommodation, and that would end up lasting for the rest of our time in that apartment. I remember that Christmas particularly clearly, because it was the first year I didn't put up the small artificial tree we usually kept in the living room, telling myself and Mateo that we were trying something different this year, rather than admitting, even to my own son, how much of my attention and emotional bandwidth was quietly being consumed by a wall I hadn't yet decided how to handle. My mother, visiting from Sacramento for 4 days that December, noticed the missing tree and asked about it directly. I deflected, telling her I'd just been busy with work. It was the first of several moments that winter where I chose not to say the full truth out loud to the people closest to me, a pattern I'd later recognize, with Priya's help, as its own quiet symptom of how thoroughly I'd absorbed the idea that managing this alone without alarming anyone was somehow the responsible thing to do. January came and went without a contractor. I followed up on January 8th, January 17th, and January 29th, each time receiving some version of the same reassurance: "This week, definitely by the weekend. I know, it's on the list," none of which ever materialized into an actual visit from anyone beyond Pete, who came once more on January 22nd and, without opening the wall further, simply reapplied bleach and mold-resistant paint to the visible surface again, the third time this exact non-solution had been applied to what was, by then, an obviously worsening structural moisture problem. I want to describe the January 29th exchange specifically because it's the moment I first heard Gary use a phrase that would recur in various forms right up until the inspection itself. When I pushed back, pointing out this would be the third round of surface treatment on a problem that clearly hadn't been solved twice before, Gary said, "Alina, I appreciate your patience, I really do. You've been more understanding about this than most tenants would be, and that doesn't go unnoticed." I remember feeling, in the moment, a small, unwelcome flush of validation at being called patient and understanding, a compliment that functioned, I now recognize clearly, as a subtle incentive to keep being exactly that: patient, understanding, and quiet, rather than a genuine acknowledgement of a problem that badly needed to stop being tolerated. That same January, a new tenant moved into 2B, a young nurse named Jordan Alvarez who I'd occasionally cross paths with in the laundry room given our overlapping shift schedules. Jordan, hearing me mention Mateo's asthma diagnosis one evening while we both waited for dryers to finish, said without much hesitation, "You know you can request the city do a habitability inspection directly, right? You don't need the landlord's permission for that." I hadn't known that, not with any real specificity, and that conversation planted a seed that would take root more fully a few weeks later, though I still wasn't ready emotionally to act on it yet. I want to describe that laundry room conversation a little more fully, because it was one of the first times in nearly a year that another adult, outside my own small circle of family and Priya, had responded to what I described not with sympathy alone but with concrete, practical information. Jordan, it turned out, had gone through a nearly identical situation at a previous apartment 2 years earlier, involving a persistent plumbing leak their own landlord had similarly minimized for months. "I waited too long too," Jordan told me, folding a stack of scrubs. "I kept thinking I was being dramatic. I wasn't. You're probably not being dramatic either." I didn't act on that conversation immediately, but I carried it with me differently than I carried most conversations from that period, filed away specifically, the way you file away a phone number you suspect you might eventually need to use. By February, Mateo had been prescribed daily controller medication in addition to his rescue inhaler, a significant escalation in his asthma management that his pulmonologist, Dr. Patricia Nwasu, described as more consistent with an ongoing environmental trigger than a typical seasonal pattern. I sat in her office on February 14th, Valentine's Day, an irony I remember noting even in the moment, and told her plainly about the wall, the timeline, the 3 failed bleach and paint attempts. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, carefully but directly, "Alina, I need to say this clearly because I think you already know it but might need to hear it from someone outside your own household. This is not a minor issue you're managing well enough. This is an ongoing exposure that is measurably affecting your son's lung function, and it needs to stop, not be treated indefinitely." I left that appointment and sat in my car in the hospital parking garage for almost 20 minutes before I felt steady enough to drive. I remember the specific quality of that 20 minutes, staring at the concrete pillar in front of my windshield, running through nearly a year of Gary's reassurances against Dr. Nwasu's plain, clinical sentence, and feeling, for the first time, something closer to genuine anger beginning to surface underneath the exhaustion I'd been carrying for months. I didn't act on that anger yet, but I remember it as the first time the emotional balance inside me had shifted meaningfully away from wanting to be understanding and toward wanting, simply, for the problem to actually stop. By March, nearly a full year after the mold first appeared, the situation in Mateo's room had become, by any reasonable standard, unlivable. The patch had grown to cover roughly 4 feet of wall, the smell was constant, and Mateo, who slept in my room by then, had started asking on bad nights whether the black wall stuff was going to make him sick again, a question no 6-year-old should have to ask about his own bedroom. On March 4th, at a tenant meeting, Gary called to discuss an unrelated matter, a proposed change to the building's parking arrangement. I raised the mold issue publicly for the first time in front of 11 other tenants, asking directly what the timeline for actual remediation looked like. I want to describe that meeting a little more fully because it was the first time I'd said any of this out loud in front of an audience beyond Gary himself, and I remember my voice shaking slightly at the start before steadying as I got further into the specifics: the ER visits, the failed bleach treatments, the daily controller medication. A few tenants I barely knew exchanged glances during that recitation, and one, an older man from 5C I'd only spoken to in passing before, nodded slowly, as though something he'd half suspected was finally being confirmed out loud. Gary's response, delivered with a small, tired laugh in front of the whole room, was the line I opened this story with, that I was the only tenant in this building who makes a federal case out of a little bit of paint peeling. Several tenants laughed along with him mildly, the way people laugh at a joke that lets everyone move past an uncomfortable moment quickly, eager to get back to the parking discussion they'd actually come for. I didn't laugh. I felt in that specific moment a very particular kind of loneliness, not because anyone in that room was being cruel exactly, but because I understood, watching the room's collective relief at being allowed to move past the subject, how easy it is for 11 months of one family's quiet crisis to be compressed, socially, into a single joke that lets everyone else feel it's been adequately addressed. I said, noted, and went home to finish packing Mateo's nebulizer for the night. The discovery happened 4 days later, on March 8th, in a way so mundane it almost didn't register at first as the turning point it actually was. I'd stopped by the building's small shared office on the ground floor to drop off my March rent check in person, since the online portal had been glitching that week, and found the door slightly ajar, Gary's desktop computer left open on a group text thread displayed on the screen, visible from where I stood in the doorway without meaning to look at anything specific at all. It was a conversation between Gary and Pete, dated February 28th, that read in part, "The mold in 4C is getting bad. That lady's kid keeps ending up in the hospital over it. Might want to actually fix it before it becomes a whole thing," from Pete, followed by Gary's response. "Not worth gutting a wall for one tenant paying under market rate. Just keep painting it. If she pushes, we'll offer her a small rent credit to keep quiet. Cheaper than a real fix." I stood very still in that doorway, holding my rent check, and felt something go quiet inside me, not rage exactly, not yet, just a kind of cold, clarifying stillness. The recognition that I wasn't looking at a landlord who'd simply been slow, overwhelmed, or genuinely uncertain about the right course of action. I was looking at a plainly stated admission in writing that Gary knew the mold was actively hospitalizing my son, had a specific cost estimate in mind for the real fix, and had decided deliberately that a bribe to keep me quiet was cheaper and preferable to actually protecting a 6-year-old's lungs. I want to describe exactly what went through my mind standing in that doorway, because I think the ordinariness of the moment matters as much as the content of the message itself. My first thought, oddly, was almost administrative, the same clinical part of my brain that takes over during a difficult shift at the hospital. A small, cold voice noting that cheaper than a real fix was, in its own way, an honest sentence at least, the first fully honest thing Gary had communicated about his actual reasoning in 11 months of reassurances. My second thought was about the other tenants, the ones I'd occasionally heard mention their own minor, unresolved maintenance issues in passing, and whether some version of this exact calculation existed about their apartments too, waiting to be discovered by someone else in another 6 months or a year if nothing changed. My third thought, the one that actually made my hands unsteady around the rent check, was simpler than either of those. He knew. He has known, specifically and numerically this entire time, exactly what it would cost to fix this properly, and he decided my son's hospitalizations were a smaller cost to him personally than that number. Gary's assistant, a young woman named Caitlin who staffed the office part-time, glanced up from her own desk and asked pleasantly whether I needed a receipt for the rent check. I told her I didn't. My voice, I remember distinctly, coming out completely level, which surprised me almost as much as the message itself had. I don't think Caitlin had any idea what was on the screen behind her, and I made a point later of never holding what I'd seen against her specifically, since nothing in our subsequent interactions suggested she'd known anything about the substance of that particular text thread. I didn't say anything in the moment. I set my rent check on the counter, said a brief, ordinary goodbye to Caitlin, and drove home holding the image of that screen in my mind the entire way, understanding with total clarity that everything I had rationalized for 11 months, he's overwhelmed with 24 units. He doesn't fully understand how serious this is. Cost is a legitimate practical concern, had just been proven, in his own words, sent carelessly on a screen I happened to glance at, to be exactly as calculated as it had always quietly felt underneath every reassuring text message. That night, once Mateo was asleep, I sat at my kitchen table for a long time without turning on the overhead light, just the small lamp in the corner, and I thought about all 11 months at once, compressed into that single phrase on a screen. I thought about April, and keep an eye on it, and May, and there's always some moisture somewhere, and August, and I've got to be consistent across the building, and October, and I'll have Pete take another look this week. Each one individually sounding reasonable enough in the moment to accept, and all of them together apparently functioning as exactly the delay tactic Gary had described plainly to his brother-in-law. Keep painting it, and if she pushes, offer a bribe instead of a fix. I didn't act on it right away. I want to be honest about that because I think it matters to how the rest of this went. I called my closest friend from nursing school, a woman named Priya Chandrasekaran who'd since become a tenant rights attorney in Seattle, that same evening, sitting on my bathroom floor with the door closed so Mateo wouldn't hear the conversation from the next room. I read her the message word for word. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said something I've thought about constantly since. "Alina, that message isn't really about mold. It's about who Gary has decided is worth protecting and who he's decided is cheap enough to manage with a bribe instead. You need to decide whether you're going to keep letting him make that calculation about your son. That sentence cracked something open in me, sitting there on cold tile with the phone pressed hard against my ear. Because underneath 11 months of reasonable-sounding delays was a fear I hadn't let myself name clearly, even to myself, until that phone call. The fear was smaller and stranger than I expected once I finally looked at it directly. It wasn't really about losing the apartment, though that fear was real too. It was about what it would mean to become, formally and publicly, that tenant, the difficult one, the one who called inspectors, the one landlords warned each other about in whatever informal network landlords maintained in a tight rental market. I had built a quiet, stable life for Mateo out of very little margin for error since my divorce, and some part of me, I understood sitting on that bathroom floor, had been terrified that pushing too hard would cost us the one thing I'd worked hardest to protect. A roof, however imperfect, that we could actually afford. Priya asked me a second question that night, one I didn't have a ready answer for. What's the actual worst-case outcome here if you file a formal complaint? I sat with that for a long moment, listening to the pipes in the wall behind me settle the way they always did in the evenings, and admitted, out loud, for the first time, what I'd been avoiding admitting even to myself. The worst case wasn't that the city would side with Gary. I had, by then, more than enough documentation to make that outcome unlikely. The worst case was smaller and stranger than that, and harder to explain. The worst case was that I would stop being the reasonable, easygoing tenant everyone at the Somerset Arms had come to expect. And I genuinely did not know who I would be in that building, or in my own sense of myself as a careful, non-confrontational person, once I was someone who had, publicly and formally, forced a landlord's hand. I sat with that fear for almost 2 weeks before I said anything to anyone else beyond Priya. During that time, I did something that felt, at first, almost clinical, almost more like a coping mechanism than an actual plan. I sat down with every photo I'd been quietly taking since September, every text message exchange with Gary going back to April, Mateo's 2 ER discharge summaries, his pulmonologist's chart notes, and the message from Pete's shared group text I'd photographed on my own phone the moment I got to my car that day, and I built a proper timeline, the kind of chronological, cross-referenced documentation I'd learned to build professionally for patient charts. Except this time the patient was my own son and the chart was my own life. Building that timeline took longer than I expected, not because the material was hard to find, but because reliving 11 months of it in sequence all at once was its own kind of quiet grief. I found myself more than once sitting at my kitchen table late at night with a specific text message open, remembering the actual feeling of receiving it in real time. The small, genuine relief after the May visit, the reluctant trust I'd extended in August, the exhausted 90 minutes of sleep numbness of texting Gary a hospital photo in October, and having to separate deliberately how reasonable each individual moment had felt from the growing, colder recognition of how completely that reasonableness had been engineered deliberately by someone who understood precisely what he was risking and choosing not to spend money on. I talked during that same stretch to Dr. Nwasu again, specifically asking whether she'd be willing to write a formal letter connecting Mateo's respiratory decline to the documented mold exposure, something she agreed to without hesitation, saying, "I should have offered before you asked." This kind of letter matters more than people realize, and it's frankly overdue. I also talked to Jordan from 2B, the ER nurse who'd first mentioned city inspections back in January, who walked me through exactly how to formally request a habitability inspection through Portland's Bureau of Development Services, a process I'd assumed, incorrectly, would require some kind of landlord cooperation or notice. I want to spend a little more time here on what this decision actually cost me emotionally, because I think it's the part of this story that matters most, even though it's the least dramatic part to describe. For nearly 2 weeks, I woke up most mornings with a tight, low-grade dread sitting in my chest before I'd even fully opened my eyes, a dread I eventually recognized, with Priya's help over another phone call, as grief for a version of my life I'd been quietly hoping to preserve. The version where I was simply a reasonable, easygoing tenant, where Gary and I stayed on friendly terms, where Mrs. Okafor's jollof rice and neighborly chats didn't get complicated by anything as formal and irreversible as a government inspection. Priya, gently on that second call, said something I've held on to since. "Alina, you're grieving the idea that staying quiet was ever actually keeping you safe. It wasn't. It was just delaying the moment you had to find that out. I also thought during those 2 weeks a great deal about Matteo himself and what kind of example I was quietly setting for him by tolerating a situation I already had more than enough proof was actively harming him. I thought about the specific night in October when he woke in struggling to breathe, and about the question he'd started asking on bad nights, whether the black wall stuff was going to make him sick again, and I understood with a clarity that finally outweighed the fear that whatever discomfort came from being labeled difficult, it would never outweigh the cost of teaching my son by example, that a parent's job was to quietly absorb harm rather than name it clearly and act on it. I want to include one more conversation from this period because it shaped how I ultimately decided to proceed. I called my mother in Sacramento on a Thursday evening near the end of March, mostly needing to hear a voice from outside the immediate situation, and found myself unexpectedly telling her the whole story from the beginning for the first time. She was quiet for a while after I finished, and then she said, "Alina, you've spent your whole career telling other people's families the truth about what's actually happening to their kids, clearly and without softening it, because you know that's the only way anyone can actually act on it in time. I don't understand why you'd extend Gary Halloran a courtesy you'd never extend to a diagnosis." I sat with that comparison for a long time after we hung up, because it reframed the entire year for me in a single sentence. I would never have told a family in my care to keep an eye on it for 11 months regarding a genuinely serious symptom. I had simply never applied the same standard to my own home. That understanding, more than the documentation itself, more than Priya's phone calls, was what finally moved me from quietly gathering proof to deciding to act on it formally, in a way that couldn't be smoothed over with a small rent credit and a promise about next week. I decided calmly, sitting at my own kitchen table on a Sunday evening in mid-March, that I wasn't going to confront Gary directly first. I was going to go around him entirely, to the one authority in the city with both the power to compel action and no financial stake whatsoever in protecting Gary Halloran's bottom line. I filed a formal habitability complaint with Portland's Bureau of Development Services on March 18, 2024, attaching my full timeline, every photograph, both discharge summaries, Dr. Nwasu's letter, and after real deliberation with Priya about whether it was legally appropriate to include a description of the group text message I'd seen on Gary's screen, clearly marked as an observation rather than a document I possessed a copy of. An inspector named Rosalind Ferrero was assigned to the case and scheduled a full building walkthrough for March 27, 19 days after I'd stood in that office doorway. I want to describe the filing process itself a little more fully, because it was, in its own small way, its own kind of turning point. I remember sitting at my kitchen table on the evening of March 18, uploading each document to the city's online portal one at a time, and feeling a specific, unfamiliar sensation somewhere between relief and grief settle over me as the confirmation email arrived. Relief because 11 months of quiet, individual management were finally, formally, becoming someone else's responsibility to assess. Grief because I understood, filing that complaint, that whatever came next, the version of my relationship with Gary where I was simply a reasonable, low-maintenance tenant, was already over, regardless of what the inspection ultimately found. In the 9 days between filing and the walkthrough, I found myself doing something I hadn't fully anticipated, quietly reaching out to a few other tenants I trusted, not to organize anything formal yet, but simply to ask carefully whether they'd noticed any unresolved maintenance issues of their own. Jordan mentioned the leak in 2B they'd reported twice without resolution. A tenant in 6A I barely knew, a graduate student named Priyanka Reddy, mentioned a cracked window seal that had been on Gary's list for over a year. I didn't push anyone to file anything themselves at that point. I simply listened and made careful, dated notes of what I heard, understanding even then that a pattern affecting one family looked very different to an inspector than a pattern affecting several. I want to describe that walkthrough carefully because it wasn't a single dramatic confrontation so much as a slow, methodical, entirely factual process that ended up being more powerful than any argument I could have made myself. Inspector Ferreira arrived with a moisture meter, a thermal imaging camera, and a checklist, and spent nearly 3 hours moving through not just my apartment but 4 other units where tenants, once they understood an inspection was actually happening, began quietly reporting their own long-ignored issues. A persistent leak in 2B that Jordan had mentioned to Gary twice without response, a cracked window seal in 6A letting in enough moisture to warp the flooring beneath it, and most seriously, active mold growth behind the water heater closet in the basement, feeding directly into the building's shared ventilation system. I remember standing in the hallway during much of that walkthrough, half listening as Ferreira moved methodically from unit to unit, and feeling a strange, quiet vindication that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with simply being believed, professionally and procedurally, for the first time in 11 months, by someone whose entire job was to assess the situation without any financial stake in minimizing it. Gary was present for parts of the walkthrough required by the inspection process to grant access, and I watched him attempt, several times, the same easy, reasonable-sounding tone he'd used with me for 11 months. When Inspector Ferreira asked him directly how long he'd been aware of the mold in 4C, he said, "We've been treating it as it comes up. It's an older building. There's always something." Ferreira, without raising her voice at all, simply held up her moisture meter, showing a reading well above safe thresholds behind the wall, and said, "Mr. Halloran, this reading indicates sustained, ongoing water intrusion, not a recent development. Do you have any maintenance records showing when this was first reported and what remediation was attempted?" Gary did not have organized records to produce. I did. When Ferreira turned to me and asked whether I had any documentation of the timeline, I handed her the same binder I'd built for myself, time-stamped photos, texts, ER records, Dr. Nwasu's letter, and said calmly, "I have a complete record going back to April of last year, if that's helpful." It was, by Ferreira's own account later, unusually thorough for a tenant complaint, and it allowed her to move directly from a standard follow-up inspection timeline to an emergency order. She flipped through the binder for several minutes, occasionally cross-referencing a specific photograph against the date on a text message beside it, and at one point looked up and said quietly, almost to herself, "This is more organized than most of the case files I build myself." I told her I worked in patient documentation for a living, and she said, "It shows. This is going to make the rest of this process considerably faster." Standing in the hallway outside 4C, with Gary present, she said plainly, "Given the extent of documented moisture intrusion, the confirmed mold presence affecting a minor with a diagnosed respiratory condition, and evidence suggesting this was known and inadequately addressed over an extended period, I'm issuing an emergency habitability order. This unit and the basement mechanical area, given its connection to shared ventilation, are being red-tagged effective today. Given the scope of what we're finding building-wide, I'll be recommending a full building inspection be scheduled within the week." Gary's face, hearing that, went through several colors in the space of about 10 seconds. He said too quickly, "This is being blown out of proportion. Most of this building is perfectly fine. You're talking about shutting down people's homes over one bad wall." I said evenly, not raising my voice at all, the line I want you to remember from this whole story. "It was never one bad wall, Gary. It was 11 months of you deciding my son's lungs were cheaper to manage than to fix." Gary tried one more angle, his voice rising slightly for the first time since I'd known him. "I've got mortgages on 3 buildings, Alina. You think I want any of this? I was trying to keep rent affordable for people like you. That's the whole reason things move slower here than at some corporate building downtown." Inspector Ferreira, who'd remained largely neutral through the earlier exchange, said quietly, "Mr. Halloran, affordability and habitability aren't the same conversation, and a landlord doesn't get to decide unilaterally that a tenant's health is the cost of keeping rent low. That decision was never yours to make on her behalf." Gary had no response that survived being said out loud in that hallway. I watched something in his posture shift during that exchange, a kind of deflation that looked, for just a moment, almost like a crack in the reasonable, folksy performance he'd maintained for nearly 3 years, not remorse exactly, but something closer to a man realizing in real time that the story he'd been telling himself about being a fair, old-fashioned landlord had never actually been tested against an outside, disinterested authority until that afternoon. The full building inspection, conducted the following week, found habitability violations in 7 of the 24 units, ranging from moderate to severe, and resulted in a citywide order requiring Gary to fund temporary relocation for 4 families, including mine, while comprehensive remediation was completed. A process that ultimately took 5 months and cost, according to the contractor invoices later produced during a subsequent tenant legal complaint, just over $140,000, considerably more than the real fix Gary had apparently decided, back in February, wasn't worth the expense for one tenant paying under market rate. The weeks that followed were quieter than I expected, and considerably messier than any neat resolution would have looked from the outside. Mateo and I, along with 3 other displaced families, were relocated to a corporate extended stay hotel Gary was required to fund for the duration of the remediation, A strange, unsettled 5 months that was hard on both of us in its own way, even as it was undeniably better than continued exposure. I remember that period as a strange kind of limbo, grateful every single day to no longer be breathing whatever was still settling out of that wall, and simultaneously exhausted by the logistics of raising a 6-year-old out of a single hotel room, driving him to the same school across town every morning, cooking dinners on a 2-burner kitchenette. Mateo, for his part, adapted with the particular resilience of small children, decorating our small hotel window with paper decorations he made at his after-school program and declaring with real conviction that our temporary house had the best pool in the whole world. A small, unearned gift of a silver lining I've been grateful for ever since. Mateo's asthma symptoms, remarkably, began improving within the first month away from the building, a changed doctor. Nwasu described it a June follow-up as about as clear a confirmation of the environmental trigger as you're likely to see clinically. His controller medication was reduced that August, and by the time we moved into a new apartment entirely, in a different building across town, that November he was down to using his rescue inhaler only occasionally, mostly during particularly cold or smoky weeks, rather than the near-daily pattern that had defined the previous winter. I remember sitting in Dr. Nwasu's office that June, watching her review his spirometry results against the numbers from February, and feeling something in my chest finally, fully unclench for what felt like the first time in nearly a year. Gary was cited by the city for multiple habitability code violations, and separately faced a joint tenant complaint filed by Priya on behalf of myself, Jordan, and 2 other affected families, which resulted in a settlement that covered our relocation costs beyond what the city order had already required, along with a modest additional sum for documented medical expenses tied to Mateo's care. Gary never apologized directly, not once, in any conversation I had with him afterward. The closest he came was a brief, stiff comment during a mediation session in September, saying only, "I didn't think it was as serious as it turned out to be," a sentence that struck me, hearing it, as both technically true and completely beside the point, given that the group text I'd seen made unmistakably clear he'd understood exactly how serious it was and simply decided it wasn't worth the cost to address properly. I want to describe that mediation session a little more fully, because it's the closest thing to a genuine humanizing moment I ever got from Gary across the entire ordeal, even though it fell well short of anything resembling real accountability. Near the end of the session, after the financial terms had largely been settled, Gary, unprompted, said something that surprised me. "My dad ran this building for 30 years without anything like this happening. I keep asking myself what he would have done differently, and I don't actually know. I think I convinced myself that keeping rent low was the important thing, the thing he would have been proud of, and I let that become an excuse for everything else. It wasn't an apology, not fully, and it didn't change the settlement terms or the 5 months my son and I had spent displaced from our home. But it was, I think, the one moment where I glimpsed something in Gary that wasn't simply calculation, a genuinely confused, aging man measuring himself against a father's legacy he'd never quite figured out how to actually live up to, rather than just perform the surface signals of. I don't forgive what happened, but I no longer think of Gary as a simple villain either, and I think that complexity is more honest than a cleaner story would be. My relationship with the Somerset Arms itself obviously ended entirely. I have not been back to that building since the day we moved our things out in November. My relationship with Gary is, unsurprisingly, non-existent now beyond what legal correspondence required during the settlement process. I don't know whether he's changed how he manages his remaining 2 properties, and I've made a kind of peace with not knowing, understanding that whatever happens there now is genuinely outside anything I have the standing or the energy to continue monitoring. My relationship with Mrs. Okafor, by contrast, is the one bright, uncomplicated thread that survived the whole ordeal intact. She was one of the 7 households affected by the wider inspection, her own unit found to have a lesser but still cited ventilation issue, and she moved that same fall to a senior housing community across the river that she describes cheerfully as finally warm in the winter. Imagine that. We still see each other roughly once a month, and she still, without fail, brings a small container of something warm whenever she visits, though these days I insist on cooking for her at least half the time in return. She told me once over tea at her new apartment, "I always knew you'd be the one to finally do something about that building, sweetheart. You've got that quiet, careful way about you that cheap men like Gary mistake for a person who'll never actually push back. I laughed at the time. I've thought about that sentence often since because I think she understood something about me before I fully understood it myself. The redemptive thread, if there is one worth naming here, runs through the other tenants who stayed at the Somerset Arms through the remediation and beyond. In the aftermath of the inspection, several of them, including Jordan from 2B, formed an informal tenant association, something the building had never had in Gary's 14 years of ownership, meeting monthly to compare notes on maintenance requests, and when necessary, escalate them collectively rather than individually. Jordan called me that December after the remediation was fully complete to tell me the association had successfully pushed Gary to finally fix the persistent leak in 2B within 2 weeks of a formal collective request, rather than the months of individual follow-up it would have taken before. We basically just did what you did, except as a group instead of alone, Jordan said. Turns out it works a lot faster that way. Priyanka Reddy from 6A, whose cracked window seal had been on Gary's list for over a year, told me something similar that spring. The association's very first collective letter, signed by 9 tenants, got her window fixed within 8 days. I like to think that's the piece of this whole story that actually matters most. Not the settlement, not even Mateo's recovered lung function, but the fact that a building full of people who'd each been managing their own version of keep an eye on it and let me know if it spreads, finally started comparing notes, and stopped being individually manageable in a way that had clearly been working in Gary's favor for a very long time. I want to close this section with one more small piece, because it circles back to something I mentioned earlier and didn't fully resolve. In October of 2024, nearly a year after Denise Kowalczyk had first asked whether everything was all right and offered her door, I finally took her up on it, telling her over coffee in the break room the full story from beginning to end. She listened without interrupting, and at the end she said quietly, "I wish you'd told me sooner, not because there was anything I could have done about your landlord, obviously. But you didn't have to carry all of that alone at work too, on top of everything else." I told her I understood that now more clearly than I had at the time. It was a small, unremarkable conversation in the scheme of everything else that had happened, but it stayed with me because it was one more confirmation of something I'd been slowly learning all year. The impulse to manage difficult things alone, quietly without alarming the people around me, had cost me more across every part of my life than I'd ever fully accounted for until I actually sat down and built the ledger. Comfort isn't the same as safety, and for nearly a year I mistook staying quiet for keeping a roof over my son's head, when in fact staying quiet was the very thing letting that roof slowly become the thing that was hurting him. It took 11 months, 2 emergency room visits, and 1 accidentally glimpsed group text to teach me the difference. And it took my 6-year-old asking whether the black wall stuff was going to make him sick again to make sure I never mistook the two for each other again. I think often now about how ordinary each individual step of that 11 months felt in isolation. Keep an eye on it and let me know if it spreads is a genuinely reasonable thing to say about a small water stain in April. I've got to be consistent across the building is a genuinely reasonable sounding principle, on its own, disconnected from everything that came before and after it. That's the machinery of it. I've come to understand not one dramatic lie, but a long chain of individually defensible delays, each one calibrated just carefully enough to survive being questioned on its own terms, and only visible as a pattern once you lay all 11 months down next to each other at once, the way Inspector Ferreira and I did on a conference table on March 27. If I could tell my younger self anything, sitting in that hallway in April of 2023 looking at a water stain the size of a dinner plate, it would be this: trust the pattern faster than you trust the individual explanation. One reasonable sounding delay is just a delay. 6 of them, each slightly worse than the last, each accompanied by a slightly more serious symptom in your child, is not bad luck. It's a decision someone else is quietly making about how much your family's health is worth to them 1 week at a time, and you don't have to wait for a group text to finally see it clearly. You're allowed to start building the file on the very first, keep an eye on it, long before you're sure you'll ever need to use it. If this story landed for you, share it with someone who's been told they're making a federal case out of something that was never actually small to begin with. They'll know exactly why, probably before they finish reading the message. Comment below and tell me your own version of keep an eye on it and let me know if it spreads, whatever form it took in your own home. And if you want to hear the next one, go ahead and hit subscribe, because there's always another quiet person out there somewhere, finally deciding to stop managing a problem alone and start documenting it instead. One last thing before I go. If you're in the middle of your own version of this right now, a landlord who keeps promising next week, a problem that keeps getting painted over instead of fixed, a small nagging feeling that you're being managed rather than actually helped, I want to say this plainly, the way Dr. Nwasu finally said it to me in that February appointment. You're allowed to stop waiting for the reasonable explanation to run out on its own. You're allowed to start the file today, whatever your version of it looks like, the timestamp photo, the saved text message, the date, and the exact words someone used to reassure you. You may never need to hand that file to an inspector. But if the day ever comes when you do, you'll already have exactly what you need, patient and complete, waiting quietly in a folder for the moment it finally matters.